Hello, in today's lecture, I'm going to talk about measuring efficiency. This lecture continues and finishes Chapter 7, the efficiency of markets, in the textbook. And before I talk about the inefficiency, just a quick recap of what I covered last week. So last week, I derived the conditions for you that hold in the equilibrium in a competitive market. And basically, I said that competitive markets are efficient because of the following two qualities hold. The marginal benefit of the last unit produced for any active buyer in the market should equal the market price. And on the other hand, for any active firm producing in the market, the marginal cost of the last unit produced equals market price as well. And under these conditions, there is no way to improve well-being of any market participant without hurting some other market participant. So if we focus on the market participants only, there is no way to uh, basically generate additional benefit for someone without hurting someone else. Now, um, another feature that you should remember from earlier in-person part of the class is that in equilibrium, the total surplus, that is the sum of the consumer and producer surplus, is maximized. We can see that, recall the definition. Consumer surplus is the area above the price level under the demand curve. It shows the um, net benefit to the consumers from purchasing goods in this market. Producer surplus is the area below the price level above the supply curve, which is also the cost curve, and it shows the net benefit to the producers from producing output in this market. So let me just shade the two triangles that correspond to the consumer and producer surplus. And so you can see that the total surplus is the area of this big shaded triangle, part of which is blue, and that value goes toward the consumers, and part of it is red, and that value goes toward the producers. And so now, if we were to analyze any market distortions, any interventions in the market that will change the equilibrium from the competitive equilibrium at the intersection of demand and supply, we can analyze the inefficiency of those policies by looking at how much surplus they destroy, how much surplus there is left in the market after the policy is implemented. But of course, recall at this point that uh, the policies are introduced for a reason different than efficiency matters. We introduce policies because we care about fixing some um, other problems, like if the distribution of incomes is completely unfair, or if consumers or producers are suffering disproportionately. So there are sometimes good reasons to um, alter the market equilibrium, but we do that at a cost of reducing the total surplus, the total gains to buyers and sellers in the market. And so in today's video, we're going to look at how to measure the inefficiency of certain policies, and we're going to focus on three particular policies that um, you should be familiar with. So I'm going to look at the price floor first, price ceiling next, and last I'm going to look at a tax situation. So let's start with the price floor. You should remember that a price floor is the minimum legal price at which the good can be traded in the market. And for a price floor to be efficient, the price floor has to be above the equilibrium price in the market. So if the government decides to introduce the price floor, that means that it wants to help suppliers. And the example of a price floor that you should recall is the price support program for the dairy producers. The government maintains artificially high prices for dairy products so that dairy producers are not making losses. So let's see what happens with the price floor. If we artificially set the price in the market higher than the equilibrium price, then at that higher price floor level, producers are willing to produce a lot. High price is a signal you should be producing a lot, because you should be producing as long as price is above your marginal costs. So if you raise the price, each firm can produce a little more. For the consumers, a higher price is a signal that they should be consuming a little less. So at a price above the equilibrium level, there is excess supply. Quantity supplied, the amount that producers are willing to offer, far exceeds quantity demanded, the amount that consumers are willing to buy. So what happens here? First of all, from the perspective of consumers, we can definitely say that consumers suffer from a price floor. For them, the price definitely increases, and there is no benefit in paying higher prices. So consumer surplus definitely falls. We recall that by definition, consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the price level. So if the price level rises, that area shrinks and consumer surplus falls. For the producers, the situation is twofold. If you recall the dairy market example, in the United States, the government, at least historically, used to buy the excess supply from the producers. So this difference between how much non-government consumers are willing to buy and how much dairy farms are willing to produce, in the United States, that difference is covered by the government. The government purchases all of that. So strictly speaking, or effectively, this results in dairy farmers producing at this point very high price and a lot of output. And so because the government purchases the excess from them, that increases producer surplus by a lot. You can see all this additional area added to the producer surplus because for them, the price level is now high and they're selling a lot. The problem here, though, is the government is incentivizing the producers to produce a lot, but all the additional units, all the output above the original market equilibrium level, they cost a lot to produce because remember that the marginal cost of production is on the supply curve, whereas to the consumers in that market, the marginal benefit lies below the marginal cost. So with the help of the government, producers produce something that costs more than the consumers value it at the consumption. Let me say that again. The firms are incentivized to produce output, the marginal benefit of which to the consumers lies below the marginal cost of its production. And that is a clear indication of waste. So for example, if we go on to the next unit after the equilibrium unit, its marginal cost is higher than the marginal benefit. So the difference is value destroyed. You produce something at a cost of $10, which the market would have only bought at, say, $7. So you lose $3 right there. You produce the next one, you lose a little more. You produce the next one, you lose a little more. The total amount that you lose by producing too much output would be the difference between the cost, the red curve, and the benefit, the blue curve. And the difference, we can label it as deadweight loss. And the area of that gray triangle would be the amount of inefficiency created by buying excess supply. We're incentivizing overproduction at costs that exceed benefits to the consumers. So that is the US example. Buying excess supply, a lot of benefit to the firms, but high deadweight loss from overproduction. Recall that in Canada, on the other hand, the government also effectively introduces a price floor, although they call it a quota, but you know that those two can be equivalent. But in their case, if the government does not buy the excess supply, well, the output falls for the producers. So they will lose some of their existing producer surplus because they have to reduce output from the equilibrium level to how much will be demanded at the new price floor / quota level. So for them, this small red triangle, that producer surplus will be lost, but on the other hand, they can be compensated by higher producer surplus from higher prices. So for them, in a situation when the government does not buy the excess supply, producer surplus changes from, and let me show you that again, from this red triangle, we cut out the small triangle, but we replace it with a rectangle on top. Price is higher for the units that you're still able to sell, but you're able to sell less because with a higher price, consumers are not willing to buy as much. So usually that results in a net increase in producer surplus, although of course there is no guarantee that the triangle of surplus lost will always be larger than the rectangle gained. So what happens here now? Producers usually benefit from it, but because the output falls, the number of transactions in this market falls, there are lost gains. Somebody is paying a lot for the last unit that they're purchasing at the price floor price, but they would still be getting a higher marginal benefit from the next unit produced than it would cost the producers to produce, except for legally, buyers and sellers in this market aren't allowed to have that trade happen. And so in this situation, the deadweight loss stems from the fact that there are trades that are potentially beneficial but are not allowed. And so these trades correspond to the reduction in output from the equilibrium level down to the price floor level of QD. So I'm going to go ahead and shade that area. That would be the deadweight loss of a price floor when the government does not buy the excess supply. So with the price floor, either too much is being produced, the quantity supplied at the price floor price, and so deadweight loss stems from overproduction, or too little is being produced, and then deadweight loss stems from underproduction. Next, let's look at the price ceiling. With the price ceiling, we only have one situation because the government does not intervene to compensate for a shortage of a product. So a price ceiling is the maximum legal price at which the good can be traded, and so that maximum legal price has to be below the equilibrium to be effective. And so if we artificially reduce the price in the market, we'll have excess demand because a lower price means consumers would want much more. On the other hand, lower price means producers will be willing to produce far less. And as I just said, the government does not offer to produce excess demand for the consumers. So with the price ceiling, quantity always falls. And what can we see here? This situation basically mirrors the second case with the price floors. First of all, from the perspective of consumers, they were earning the equilibrium price, so the price level was high. With the price ceiling, the price level goes down, so producer surplus definitely has to go down. Producer surplus definitely falls. From the consumer perspective, they benefit from lower prices, so that would increase their surplus. But on the other hand, they suffer from the fact that less product is available in the market. And so I can show the change in the consumer surplus by doing two things. First of all, I'm going to cut out the small blue triangle because it corresponds to the surplus from the trades that do not happen in the market anymore. On the other hand, I'm going to add up this white rectangle to the consumer surplus because for trades that are still happening in the market, the value of those trades for the consumers increase. So consumer surplus changes from this triangle to the trapezoid, and you can see consumers lost a small triangle, but were compensated with this blue rectangle. And again, usually the gain from lower prices is larger than the loss from lower quantity, and so consumer surplus tends to increase. At least it would be unreasonable to have a policy in which consumer surplus will reduce, producer surplus will reduce. Somebody has to benefit from such a policy, and if consumers don't benefit from a price ceiling, this is really a bad policy. But again, we took our large total surplus under the competitive equilibrium, temper the price, and once we tempered the price, we ended up cutting out a chunk of it. And so that chunk again corresponds to the deadweight loss, because with the price ceiling, quantity traded in the market falls from the equilibrium level down to a lower level, quantity supplied at the price ceiling price. And so because these trades do not happen any longer, the value that producers and consumers would have gained through those trades is wasted. And so we call the value wasted the deadweight loss in this example. Sorry, I don't have a gray triangle to cover this area. The final example for today, example of a tax. And you are probably familiar with taxes. Usually the best example is if you purchase something online, or if you purchase something in a grocery store, sometimes there is a sales tax added on top of the price that you're paying. So you're probably most familiar with the percentage taxes. For convenience, I'm just going to use a flat per unit tax of $2. So the idea here would be that whenever a trade takes place, one party, either the buyers or the sellers, would be forced to pay $2 to the government. And so to make things familiar to you, think about how the tax is added on top of the price that you see on the price tag when you check out either online or in a grocery store or in a pharmacy. So after tax, the price that the consumer pays equals the price that the producer receives plus this $T that the government gets. So basically, after tax, the difference between the two prices should be equal to the amount of the tax. For example, if there is a $5 tax on cigarettes, then the consumer who buys cigarettes will be paying the producer price plus $5 on top of that. So the consumer's expense will exceed the producer's revenue by the amount of $5. How does that affect the equilibrium in the market? Well, now consumers and producers are not getting the same price. Consumers will be forced to pay more, producers will be forced to pay less, and because of that, the quantity has to fall. And so, in the equilibrium with tax, we need to find a new quantity at which the difference in prices exactly equals the amount of tax. So if it's $5, that difference has to be equal to $5. What happens in this situation? Well, you can see clearly that consumers are paying higher price, producers are getting lower price. So consumer surplus has to fall. Producer surplus also has to fall. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Producer surplus also has to fall. And so we can see that a tax negatively affects both sides of the market. And in this example, I deliberately don't mention who gets to pay the tax, because really for the welfare analysis, for the analysis of the inefficiency, it doesn't really matter if I'm taxing consumers or if I'm taxing producers. Ultimately, both the consumer and the producer surplus will be reduced no matter who's being taxed. So what happens to the surplus that is in this white area, the surplus that used to belong to consumers and producers? Well, part of that surplus goes to the government in the form of tax revenue. Recall that the government, once the government introduces the tax, the amount traded in the market corresponds to QT. So graphically, it's this length. And the tax that the market participants pay to the government corresponds to $T, and it equals the length of this vertical bar. So the area of this rectangle, large rectangle here, would correspond to the tax revenue of the government. Basically, when the government introduces a tax, it inserts a peg between the price consumers pay and the price that producers receive. The height of that peg is exactly the amount of the tax, and with that peg, the government is able to collect tax revenue. But again, because the output in the market falls from the equilibrium level down to some lower level of output, there's going to be deadweight loss. There are some interactions that are potentially beneficial, but their benefit is below the amount of the tax. So consumers who were getting, say, surplus of $1 and given the producers a surplus of $1 would not be able to do that once the tax is 5. And so again, the situation is the same. Once the tax is introduced, you can calculate the inefficiency that it generates by calculating the area of the Great Triangle. That would be the amount of deadweight loss, the foregone gains that are destroyed by the tax. Thank you.